What's up guys, Mike Thomas, aka the Young Trishula here. Today I want to talk about another new archetype that was revealed last night. This time though, not from Tactical Masters, but from Power of the Elements, the next base set coming out in the OCG in April. And this deck is even cooler than the last one. And I mean that in both terms of design and in terms of gameplay. So the cards are called the Vernalizer Fairies, and they seem to be roughly based on Winnie the Pooh, and that alone should hopefully get you excited for the archetype. I don't know about you guys, but I think Winnie the Pooh is pretty nifty. But they also have really good effects, and I think they actually slot really well into an already existing archetype that would just benefit greatly from having these cards. So without wasting any more of your time, let's hop into these cards and we'll read through them, and then I want to talk about what I think these cards can actually see competitive use for. Okay, so jumping into these cards, we have the YGO organization article that translated and revealed these cards. So the tagline is fairies cursing forest critters with the burdens of sapience, just ahead of the spring equinox too. So very, very cool. The first card we have is Vernalizer Fairy of Hills and Blooms, and this I guess is the fairy cursing animals with sapience. This little fairy is a level 4 earth fairy effect monster with 200 attack and 2000 defense. You can only use its first effect of this card's name once per turn, and that effect is that you can discard this card and one other monster or Vernalizer Fairy card to add any Vernalizer Fairy card from your deck to your hand except itself. Then you can special summon one earth monster from your graveyard, but you cannot activate monster effects for the rest of this turn except earth monsters. This card is not only a Rhoda, but it is a free extender. And what's nice about this, what's interesting about this, is that even though it seems like a -1 at first with you having to pitch a card, you can pitch an earth monster to the graveyard with this card and then summon it back. Really, this card just says search any Vernalizer Fairy and then also summon any earth monster from your hand or graveyard, which is really strong when you think about that this will allow you to cheat out any earth monster in the game more or less for free at the cost of having to lock yourself into earths. Now the next Vernalizer Fairy we have is Vernalizer Fairy of the Forests and Awakening. So it says here that it is a level 2, but if you look at the picture, it is clearly a level 4, so I think that's a little oopsie poopsie on YGO organization's part. But it is a level 4 Earth Fairy effect monster with 900 attack and 1800 defense, and you can only use its first and second effects once each. And like the previous Vernalizer Fairy, you can discard this card and one other monster or Vernalizer Fairy card, send from your deck to the graveyard an earth monster that can be normal summon set, then special summon an earth monster with a different name from your graveyard, but you cannot activate monster effects except for earth fairies. So what's interesting here is that this can Foolish Burial anything for you to get specialed out. So if you have multiple Vernalizer Fairies in your hand, you can use this to foolish anything that you want, and like you could foolish Scrap Recycler, for example, and then summon back the Vernalizer Fairy of the Forest and Awakening because it does not prevent you from summoning itself back. Then use a different Vernalizer Fairy to reborn the Scrap Recycler and play from there. And then the second effect of Vernalizer Fairy of the Forest and Awakening is you can target any Vernalizer Fairy you control and double its attack until the end of the turn. That's not too crazy, but it does mean that this card is essentially an 1800, so not too bad. Then we have Vernalizer Fairy of the Flowers and Fields, which is a level 3 Earth Fairy effect monster with 600 attack and 1600 defense. You can discard it and another monster or Vernalizer card. I think you're kind of seeing the theme here by now. Add any Earth monster from your graveyard to your hand except this card, then special summon an Earth monster from your graveyard. So if you haven't already picked up on the theme of this archetype, they all pitch themselves and a name in order to do something related to an earth monster and then also bring back any earth monsters from your graveyard, and they can all special summon out themselves as well, which makes these cards really cool extenders, just such really good extenders, and they all have decent effects. So you could really just consider all of these cards just self-summoning monsters with good effects. Definitely not bad by any stretch of the imagination. And our bunny has one other effect too, that it makes it so that your opponent cannot target any Vernalizer Fairy monsters you control with card effects. Now, this effect seems a little bit innocuous, but I think this effect is actually going to be really good, and we'll get into that in a couple minutes. So the final of the Vernalizer Fairies we have is Winnie the Pooh himself. Wolf. We have Vernalizer Fairy of the Mountains and Melting Snow. Like the rest of them, he has the discard effect, but I think Winnie the Pooh here is actually the best Vernalizer Fairy to just be included in any deck. Like, I think that this card is extremely splashable, and the reason for that is that his effect is just draw one card. And then, of course, the rest of the Vernalizer Fairy effect that you can just special summon out an Earth monster from your graveyard. So this card, if you're playing an Earth-centric deck, this card is actually just Upstart Goblin if you're playing a deck like Earth Machine. So this card is really strong in my opinion. It is not only an upstart, but it's also a monster reborn, and I think that that is just so powerful to print on a single card, especially for archetypes like Earth Machine, and I think that this is a fantastic card for it. I think this card will actually see competitive play just anytime there's a mono Earth deck. Then its second effect is you can target a Vernalizer Fairy monster you control. It can make a second attack during each battle phase this turn. Not too crazy, however, that you could see if you were playing a Vernalizer Fairy deck, you could, make this effect relevant, right? And where this effect, as well as the effects of the Flowers and Fields and the Forest and Awakening effect would kind of come into play, is with their continuous spell. So Flower Crown of the Vernalizer Fairy, Earth monsters you control are treated as Vernalizer Fairy monsters. So this card right here is actually really interesting, because if you were to play this, you could, for example, make a River Stormer that has 5,000 attack and can attack twice by just turning it into a Vernalizer Fairy and using the effects of these Vernalizer Fairy monsters. So its second effect is once per turn, if a Vernalizer Fairy in your hand would discard itself and another card to activate its effect, you can make it only discard itself instead. So that part's definitely not bad. It's definitely appreciated, but I think the real power here in this deck is being able to turn every Earth monster you control into a Vernalizer Fairy, which has the potential to just get completely out of hand. Though I'm not sure if you would play this card. But I think this could actually go crazy if it's set up properly. Then this deck has a couple traps revealed. You have Calendar Rotation of the Vernalizer Fairy. You can target a Vernalizer Fairy monster in your graveyard, either add it to your hand or special summon it during your opponent's turn. If you have no cards in your hand except during the turn this card was sent to the graveyard, you can banish this card from your graveyard, special summon as many Vernalizer Fairies with different names as possible from your graveyard, but return them to your hand in the end phase. This trap card here is actually really cool, because this deck is very discard heavy, so you could see how you would potentially run out of resources kind of fast if you were playing this deck as a pure deck. So giving this deck essentially a soul charge is really cool, especially when they bounce all back to your hand. At the end of the turn, you could, for example, set this up where this is in your graveyard at the end of your turn. Then during your opponent's turn, they make their play or whatever, and then in their end phase, you just summon out 3 or 4 Vernalizer Fairies, bounce them all back to your hand, and just continue to play next turn, monster reborning everything and just building crazy boards. I think this card is really strong. I think this card is really, really strong. And then, of course, we have the final card of the archetype, the second trap. You can only activate 1 card with this name per turn, and its effect is you can target face-up cards your opponent controls up to the number of Earth monsters, special summon from the graveyard with different names. Return Earth monsters you control to the hand equal to the number of targets, and if you do, return those targets to your hand. So this card would be played more in a pure Vernalizer Fairy deck, and using this trap, you could effectively bounce up to like 3 or 4 cards. This card would be insanely powerful in combination with Calendar Rotation, because you would be able to special summon out as many Vernalizer Fairies as possible and then use this in order to bounce everything. So a very realistic combo I could see here is using the Searcher to add the trap card to your hand, and then pitching the trap card with another one of the Vernalizer Fairies, setting up some board, maybe linking off some of these guys into like an Asa or whatever, and then on the opponent's turn, banishing this, summoning out 4, and then bouncing 4 with Fairy and Flower Buds, and it could just get really out of hand really fast. But I think that these cards are really interesting, and in combination, I think these cards have the potential potential to be completely devastating. I don't know how consistent this might be in the current Yu-Gi-Oh metagame, but definitely something to keep your eye on, because, you know, this is a lot of value, just a few cards. So definitely something to watch out for. Definitely an interesting combination of cards. Now, I did say that I wanted to talk about how I think these cards will do in a competitive landscape. I did mention already Earth Machine as a deck that I think these cards could be really strong in, but I think there's another place too, and I think that that's in the case of Adamantipator. Now, Adamantipator is a mostly Earth-centric deck. Of course, there are cards that are non-Earth-centric in the deck, like Halki Fibrax and whatnot, but if you structure your turn in such a way to where you are using your Halki Fibrax or maybe like your Savage Dragon or whatever in the early stages of your turn, and then once you're past a certain point, then you can start freely using the Vernalizer Fairies. I think these cards would be really strong for that. I don't know if you would really play that many of them in another deck outside of Vernalizer Fairies, but I think that these cards have a lot of potential in any Earth-based strategy. Two of the better ones are level 4, so they could help you set up potential Gallant Granites. The Winnie the Pooh one is just really strong in general, allowing you to just Monster Reborn anything, as well as just freely drawing a card. So I think these cards definitely have potential. I think the combination of the 2 trap cards is also really strong, with the calendar rotation trap being absolutely crazy for what it is. I don't know if this deck will be competitive as a pure deck, but I think it definitely has potential as a splash engine, and I think it's really neat. I think the cards look cool. I think they have fun art, and hopefully we get to see these cards do something when they come to the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, and I'm looking forward to them. So let me know down in the comments whether or not you are excited for these cards, whether or not you think these cards are good, or if you think they are absolute doo-doo garbage. If you did enjoy this video, do drop it a like. It does help the channel out a lot. Or consider subscribing. The channel has been growing so much recently, and I would love for you to be a part of that growth. But anyway, that's about all I have for you guys today. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next video.